Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Modern Money Doughnuts, a show about modern monetary theory and ecological economics. My name's Gabrielle Bond. I'm the organiser for the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, and I'm also a director at Modern Money Lab. And I'm here with my co-host, Stephen.
Hello, I'm Stephen Hale. I'm Adjunct Associate Professor at Torrens University here in Adelaide, and I'm also an economist at Modern Money Lab.
So in Australia, if you're listening in Australia, today is a public holiday, you'll know it's Australia Day, but it's also Invasion Day or Survival Day for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I want to acknowledge today that we're on stolen land, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm here on Kaurna land in the Adelaide city. Stephen, whose land are you on?
I'm on the land of the Paramank people in the Adelaide Hills.
So our guest today, I'll just quickly introduce him. Our guest today, Philip Lorne, was recently made an adjunct professor at Torrens University, Australia. He's a former associate professor in the business school at Flinders University and currently also a visiting lecturer at the University of Adelaide. Phil is also a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and a member of the Wakefield Futures Group of Concerned Scientists. Professor Lorne, our friend Phil, founded the International Journal of Environment, Workplace and Employment in 2004, and he served as a founding editor of the journal until 2009. Phil is one of the main developers and promoters of the Genuine Progress Indicator, also known as the GPI, which as an indicator of social well-being, and Phil is one of Australia's leading ecological economists. So we're very pleased to have him on our show today. Phil's undertaken commissioned work for the governments of South Australia, Queensland and Victoria. He's published many peer-reviewed research papers, including in A-star rated academic journals, and written or edited several important books relating to the principles and policy aspects of sustainable development, most notably his 2016 book, Resolving the Climate Change Crisis, the Ecological Economics of Climate Change. Wonder if we can bring in our friend and esteemed colleague, Phil Lorne.
Yeah, let me just say something while we're doing that. You might remember that in our first show, we explained we're living well beyond some of our planetary boundaries, particularly relating to climate change. Phil, is climate change the issue or is it something more fundamental?
Oh, well, firstly, for having me on, welcome opportunity to say a few things today. I would argue that as much as climate change is obviously a very serious problem, it's a symptom of a much larger problem, and that is the excessive scale of the economy relative to the supporting ecosphere. So many of our global environmental problems are symptoms of this much larger problem of excessive growth of the economy beyond what the natural environment can ecologically sustain. So
maybe we can put the second slide up.
So dealing with climate change, you just can't deal with it as a separate problem. You have to deal with the underlying cause of the problem, as is the case with global environmental problems.
Could we perhaps put the second slide up, Shane? Not the first one, which has got Phil's picture on. If we can move to the second one. Could you explain this picture for us, Phil? This relates to what you were just talking about, I think.
Oh, okay. So this is work that has been undertaken for some time by the Global Footprint work, and they established an indicator of the ecological footprint. What is the ecological footprint? It essentially measures the land area required to provide the resources, to absorb waste and provide the key ecosystem services to support the economy. And you can see the sort of the reddish line has been going upwards since 1961, indicating that, and this is at a global level, that the ecological footprint demands on level have increased pretty much over period since 1961, You can see a green line represents the biocapacity of the planet. So where it says 1 year on the horizontal axis, that's 1 Earth. We've only got 1 Earth to provide or supply or provide the land area in order to generate the resources, absorb waste, provide ecosystems on an ongoing basis. So the biocapacity green line represents sustainable supplies of resources and the capacity to absorb waste. The red line demands on the planet, and you can see that around about 1970, our demands at the global on the planet exceeded the planet could supply on a sustained basis.
When was the tipping point?
So it's about 1970, according to the Global Footprint Network. So you might ask, how can the ecological footprint exceed biocapacity? Because at present, around about 1.7 Earths. That only goes to about 2017. It got up to about 1.7. It fell back to about 1.6 Earths because of the COVID pandemic, but it's since gone back up to about 1.7. So we're back where we were in about 2019. So how can you ecological footprint beyond what the planet can provide on a sustainable basis? Well, you can do it only because humans are starting to eat into natural capital. So a forest can provide trees on an ongoing basis forever, so long as you extract or harvest timber no greater than the forest can grow timber, regenerate. If you start harvesting beyond the generation rate of the forest, you're not only consuming income, you start consuming the capital with the forest itself. And you can keep doing that, but you can't do that forever. What we're doing is essentially only consuming the income generated by natural capital, but we're eating into the stock natural capital. And of course, you can't keep doing that. 0.7 Earth that really represents it's telling us that if we were to require resources and absorb, and generate waste that are absorbed by the natural environment, and of course enjoy services provided by the natural environment, key ecosystem service on an ongoing basis, given at the rate at which we're using resources and generating waste now, do that on an ongoing sustainable basis, we would need 1.7 Earths, and we've only got 1. In a sense, that means the resource demands and the waste generated to sustain the economy, the global economy at its current scale, is ecologically unsustainable. So we're well beyond, we're in overshoot. As some folks in Global Footprint Network referred. And it's because of that overshoot that's the underlying cause of our global environmental problems, including climate change. So hopefully just moving towards renewables won't be enough. We have to have the technical capacity to move toward renewables, but what we'd have to do to move towards renewables would still be at a scale that can be ecologically sustained.
I might just usefully summarize a little bit, because although it's fine for the show, your internet connection isn't all that good, Phil. So we were dropping out, or at least it was dropping out for me a little bit there. But what Phil was saying, I think, is that we are far from living sustainably at the moment, and we've been far from living sustainably, and increasingly far as a planet since 1970. We mentioned some of the sustainability principles that people like Herman Daly have explained in the past in a previous show. So that means we're emitting waste more quickly than the environment can safely absorb it. It means we're using renewable resources more quickly than they can be renewed. It means we're using non-renewable resources more quickly than they can be replaced. And these people at the Global Footprint Network, they're not jokers. They are a variety of very highly credentialed Earth system scientists. And what Phil was just saying is that we are now, according to these guys, 70% beyond our global planetary boundary in terms of our impact on the planet, and that this cannot be sustained for very long without having a severe impact on our ability to provision ourselves on this planet in the future. If I could ask you, Phil, we obviously then need to move back within our biocapacity, and we need to do it quite quickly. But we need to do that in a way which maintains people's existing quality of life and even improves it. Is there a useful indicator or guide that policymakers could be looking at to help them when it comes to moving us towards a future which is both sustainable and providing people with a good quality of life?
Yes. Let me just point out, from a sustainability point of view, no economic indicator can tell you where the economy, whether we're talking at the global level or the national level, is with respect to the capacity. That's the maximum sustainable scale of the economy. You need the local indicators, and of course but of course, once you've perhaps brought the scale of the economy back to within that is ecologically sustainable, which an economy that virtually doesn't exist, to one that is at the maximum sustainable scale, so the range of scales you can operate at, you then have to ask the question, what's the most appropriate scale? And an indicator that's very useful as a guide in terms of where you perhaps should operate within zero and the maximum sustainable scale is the genuine progress indicator, the GPI.
Could we have the next slide, Sharon? Just while Phil's talking about that. This is a slide from a presentation that Phil did last year. Don't worry about the 2011 at the top there, but perhaps, Phil, you could explain how the genuine progress indicator does what you were just saying, and something about how you go about estimating the genuine progress indicator for countries, and maybe why it's a more useful indicator than gross domestic product, which everyone's heard of.
Right. Well, let me just say something about the GPI and what it is, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about the GPI. A lot of people see some of those items. There's some benefit cost items. So you estimate the dollar value for these items, and you quite easily subtract the cost items from the benefit items to come up with the bottom line figure for the GPI, which you can see down the bottom there, as opposed to GDP, which just simply adds things up. So if economic activity, whether it's beneficial or whether it's detrimental, it doesn't matter. It's just all added up together. But a lot of people will look at those items and say, well, I think there's something else that perhaps should be in there that is an indication of people's well-being. Well, let me just say from the beginning that the genuine progress indicator is not designed to measure our total welfare. It's not meant to include everything. What the genuine progress indicator attempts to do is to measure the contribution that economic activity makes towards our well-being. Okay. Mother Nature.
That's a very good distinction, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, so nature provides all these services anyway. I guess you could probably say that human beings are dissatisfied with just the services provided by Mother Nature. You don't want to sit on a wooden log because it's not comfortable. So
things like education and arts and community building.
Just that we have like a wooden chair. Wooden chair is far more comfortable to sit on the wooden log. So we have so economic activity adds value to the value that's already embodied in natural resource. So Mother Nature provides. So there's there's a lot about various theories of value. There's the labour theory of value, and one of the great problems with the labour theory of value is it assumes that all value is created by labour. Well, in fact, nature provides to start, and what we do in production is we add more value to the matter and energy embodied in resources. We just transform natural resources through the agency of human-made capital, that's plant, machinery, equipment, and labour, into things that have great use value. But of course, much as that adds value, it's beneficial, it comes at a cost. The way we organise ourselves leaves some people unemployed, there are other social problems, so we need to track those costs from the economic benefits generated by adding value through production. And of course, we sacrifice some environmental value. So cut down a tree, even if we do it on a sustainable basis, there's some loss of ecosystem value. And so, of course, if we do it unsustainably, that's a significant cost. So, economic activity adds value, provides benefits, comes at a cost. And what the GPI attempts to do is to measure the difference between the benefits and costs. And ideally, operate at a scale where the difference between the two is at a maximum. You don't have to be exactly at, is sometimes referred to as the optimal scale, but somewhere around it. That's the desirable scale. And that's likely to be much smaller than the maximum sustainable scale. So you don't really want to be right at the ecological precipice. You want to be somewhere with a scale of economic activity much smaller than that. And GPI can help us to determine what that appropriate scale is.
Phil, you've calculated the GPI for every country in the world. Is that true?
Well, not quite.
Close.
I'm in a position to be able to do it. I just need some funding to be able to do it. But I've done it for about a dozen countries. Really well for about 4. So the template exists for me to do that. And of course, then I'd be able to calculate it at the regional level, also at the local level.
That's very exciting. Yes, I think when I was looking at your bio, you had done a calculation for South Australia, which is where we are. And that is actually available from our Modern Money Lab website, modernmoneylab.org.au. And if you go to, I think it's resources, there is, it's one of our working papers on our website. So anybody can go and have a look at that. Please, make it available if you want to have a read.
So would it be fair to say that gross domestic product, which everybody is still obsessed with and policymakers focus on and are terribly scared if it ever falls and people start talking about a recession, that is just a measure of the total amount of spending on goods and services produced in an economy over time? It includes a lot of things which are in fact costs and not benefits at all. So it's certainly not a good measure of well-being on that score. And it also includes a lot of activities that we undertake which actually are just defending us against other costs which have been generated as a result of economic activity. The classic example people often give is if an oil tanker is hulled, then trying to clear up the mess adds to GDP, although it's just purely defensive. Or if we end up with a climate which is so hot you can't go outside and we need air conditioning, then the spending on the air conditioning adds to gross domestic product as well. Whereas the genuine progress indicator is an attempt to identify the major benefits and costs of economic activity, not just the economic ones, but also the social ones. So I notice you've got the costs of both involuntary unemployment and indeed overemployment in the calculation. And of course, the ecological ones too. I imagine that many of these cost and benefit calculations are bound to be, to an extent, subjective. Is that fair as well? I mean, that's a criticism you sometimes hear of the GPI.
Oh, that's fair. It's not easy to calculate these things, but I just say to the people who GPI, I don't think it's difficult to be critical of the GPI in itself because it's economics. You know, you're comparing the benefits and the costs of whatever you're doing, which is to economics, even mainstream economics. So for those who it's difficult to be critical.
Well, I think
the criticism of the calculation of various items I can be justified, but I say to those people, come up with a better method to calculate them. I'm more than, if they can come up with a better method to use, then I'm more than to use it.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater just because it's difficult to calculate some of these items.
Yeah.
So if policymakers were to move to the GPI as their main focus, and away from just the scale of economic activity, GDP, what difference would that make?
It would indicate that, so I don't know if you've got the slide comparing the per capita GDP and per capita GPI for Australia.
We can put that slide up. Shane, can we have the next slide up? That's there you go. You can see GDP per capita per person rising for Australia over time, whereas the genuine progress indicator is much flatter.
Yeah, that's for the period 1986 to 2016, so it's a little bit dated, but the red line represents the per capita GPI, and you can see over the study period that it hasn't risen at all compared to the rise in per capita GDP. Some people call it the GPI because if you recall the previous slide where you had all the benefit and cost ones, there are a lot of cost items, but I could break up one of the benefit items so that you had almost any benefit items as items. So form of
why has Australia's gross domestic product risen much faster than its genuine progress indicator? What explains the growing gap between the two?
Okay, well, it's something I haven't mentioned about the GPI, apart from measuring benefits and costs. And getting back to the point I was making about the GPI, a lot of people it's focused on many costs. Well, in fact, one of the benefits that's included in the GPI that's not included in the GDP is household labour. And it's enormous.
Wow, that's a big one.
It has enormous value. So bear in mind that the GPI is lower than the GDP, and GPI is including household labour, which the GDP is. So why is the GDP rising? Well, obviously the level of spending on services within the formal economy has grown over time. I've worked out that about a lot of countries, about 25 to 30% of 60 years has been due to nothing more than a lot of economic activity being transferred from the unpaid informal sector to the formal sector. So it's no increase in economic activity at all. Now, it's, if you have a transfer from the informal to the formal part of the economy, as much as that will lead to an increase in GDP, it doesn't lead to an increase in the GPI. Right? Because household labour, if that's what's happening, fewer people are doing household labour, they're paying for household labour services and so forth, or they're getting someone to mow their rather than mowing themselves and so forth. Well, that means that the value of household labour goes down, but the value of purchased goods under consumption goes up. So one just cancels the other, whereas with GDP, the consumption goes up, but since household labour is not in GDP, there's nothing going down. So as much as there's no increase in it,
we've frozen
a lot of it's not even an increase in economic activity, but an increasing percentage of even formal economic activities, what you mentioned before, defensive and rehabilitative measures. So, if climate change really takes hold and the Earth's and oceans start to rise, we might find that the Netherlands is spending an enormous percentage of its GDP simply raising the dike walls, so it doesn't get flooded. That would increase its GDP, but it wouldn't increase its GPI because defensive and rehabilitative measures are not included in the GPI. Not saying that they're not beneficial. They're not saying they shouldn't do that. They're welfare maintaining. When you raise the dike wall, you're not increasing the well-being of people in the Netherlands. You're preventing the country from being inundated with seawater, but it can cost that's going to use resources. It's going to lead to environmental costs. So environmental cost item go up, the benefits falling whilst the GDP is rising.
Okay.
I think that's where we can perhaps bring modern monetary theory into this discussion, because we've focused obviously a lot on ecological economics today, but the resources that countries have to do that kind of mitigation and protection for their citizens against the worst of the effects of climate change. What does that have to do with monetary sovereignty? Do we have time to talk about that for a few minutes?
Yes, we could. I mean, what we know from modern monetary theory is that as long as something is physically possible to do, it can be done. In the sense that there's no financial constraint. It might be a financial constraint to you and me, even a very, very large, wealthy company to do it, but no financial constraint to the country. If the central government is monetary sovereign, it can always find the money to put resources that are idle to use to deal with environmental problems. The problem that a lot of countries do face is that we saw that the global economy has grown beyond its ecologically sustainable scale. And that's because more than half the world's countries have grown beyond their maximum sustainable scale. So the great difficulty that some of those countries have is that they need to allocate more resources to deal with these problems at a time when they're already using resources beyond what can be ecologically sustained. So they're going to have to make some pretty tough decisions. They're going to have to take resources away from trivial things, producing less junk. There's plenty of junk that gets produced and consumed, and prioritise the allocation of resources within their sustainable limits. So they're going to reduce the quantity of resources that they, in fact, use because they're already beyond sustainable levels, and use them in such a way. And so we're probably going to see if you use the GI and the ecological footprint as a way of guiding the physical scale of the economy and trying to keep it within logical limits, it will force the country to use resources more prudently. Have to. Yeah. At present, we don't use, or country doesn't use them as prudently because what we tend to do, if we need more resources to do something, we just extract more resources from the environment. And so the ecological footprint just goes up. We go beyond ecologically sustainable limits.
As an activist, I would love to see a campaign to replace the GDP with the GPI. I think that would be just absolutely transformative.
Well, I think that's a campaign that we hope to add to, and we hope Phil will be able to add to in the work that we're going to be doing at Torrens University over the next few years. I think we're going to need to get Phil back on in the near future. First of all, we're going to need to get Phil back on, and we might do it from the uni. So we've got a great internet connection.
Apologies for that.
Haven't I been coming with you?
Secondly,
really. That's all right.
Secondly, we really haven't finished the story yet. There's lots of other things to say. First of all, we could have pointed out that although Australia has a lower GDP per capita than the US, Australia has a higher genuine progress indicator than the US at the moment. And that has a lot to do with income distribution. We haven't talked about distribution because if we're going to, without increasing the scale of our impact on the planet, improve the quality of life of most people, then the distribution of income and wealth in very unjust economies where there is an extremely uneven distribution, and Australia is bad enough, but the US is much worse, is something we need to address. And secondly, we haven't had time this time around to focus really on the fact that if economic activity has costs as well as benefits, as is measured by the GPI, and Phil briefly mentioned, we will discuss with him in detail next time, that means that when you get past a certain point, and there is a strong argument that in many countries we're past this point already, the costs of additional economic activity outweigh the benefits. In other words, growth, you can call it growth if you like, but it's not really economic. Increasing GDP, far from adding to well-being in the future, will subtract from it under those circumstances. So I'd like to ask Phil back on very soon to talk about those issues. Meantime, there's a couple of things we need to say before we say goodbye. First of all, we're going to be talking to the environmental activist who recently sued the UK government over climate change policy. campaign of Scottish independence, presenter of a modern monetary theory podcast, and person who was partly responsible for the Scottish National Party adopting a job guarantee as part of their policy platform at their recent conference. Kyrene Robertson, we'll be talking to her next week, really looking forward to that. And secondly, we need to say that on KRTD, in half an hour's time, there is a show with Joe Firestone, who everybody knows, who's going to be running a show today called Democracy Hangs in the Balance, which I think is going to be a really interesting show that nobody will want to miss, certainly including me. But it only remains really to say thanks very much to Professor Lorne for joining us today. That was fascinating as a part one. I think we're going to need not just part two, but parts 2, 3, and 4 of this discussion, I think, as time goes by. So you'll see Phil regularly on the show with us. And thank you to my co-host, Gabby. And we'll all say goodbye and thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching and listening. See you next time.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.